So, I'm going to tie things together a little bit with a sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya, Book of the Sevens, but also going to continue on with Metta, because there's more that can be said about that, and there's so many different angles that we can come at it from. So I'll start with this particular sutta, which talks about developing different perceptions, 7 different perceptions that culminate in the deathless when they're developed and cultivated, and signs to look for to know that those perceptions have been developed and cultivated. And I'll continue on with another talk from Bloom, Ajahn Sona. This is Anguttara Nikaya, Book of the Sevens, Sutta 49, Perceptions. Bhikkhus, these 7 perceptions, when developed and cultivated, are of great fruit and benefit, culminating in the deathless, having the deathless as their consummation. What 7? The perception of unattractiveness, the perception of death, the perception of the repulsiveness of food, the perception of non-delight in the entire world, the perception of impermanence, the perception of suffering in the impermanent, and the perception of non-self in what is suffering. These 7 perceptions, when developed and cultivated, are of great fruit and benefit, culminating in the deathless, having the deathless as their consummation. It was said, the perception of unattractiveness, bhikkhus, when developed and cultivated, is of great fruit and benefit, culminating in the deathless, having the deathless as its consummation. For what reason was this said? When a bhikkhu often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of unattractiveness, his mind shrinks away from sexual intercourse. It turns back from it, rolls away from it, and is not drawn toward it, and either equanimity or revulsion becomes settled in him. Just as a rooster's feather or a strip of sinew thrown into a fire shrinks away from it, turns back from it, rolls away from it, and is not drawn toward it, so it is with regard to sexual intercourse when a bhikkhu often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of unattractiveness. If, when a bhikkhu often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of unattractiveness, his mind inclines to sexual intercourse, or if he does not turn away from it, he should understand. I have not developed the perception of unattractiveness. There is no distinction between my earlier condition and my present one. I have not attained the fruit of development. Thus he clearly comprehends this. But if when he often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of unattractiveness, his mind shrinks away from sexual intercourse, and either equanimity or revulsion becomes settled in him, he should understand. I have developed the perception of unattractiveness. There is a distinction between my earlier condition and my present one. I have attained the fruit of development. Thus he clearly comprehends this. When it was said, the perception of unattractiveness, bhikkhus, when developed and cultivated, is of great fruit and benefit, culminating in the deathless, having the deathless as its consummation, it is because of this that this was said. It was said, the perception of death, bhikkhus, when developed and cultivated, is of great fruit and benefit, culminating in the deathless, having the deathless as its consummation. For what reason was this said? When a bhikkhu often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of death, his mind shrinks away from attachment to life, turns back from it, rolls away from it, and is not drawn toward it, and either equanimity or revulsion becomes settled in him. Just as a rooster's feather or a strip of sinew thrown into a fire shrinks away from it, turns back from it, rolls away from it, and is not drawn toward it, so it is in regard to attachment to life, when a bhikkhu often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of death. If, when a bhikkhu often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of death, his mind inclines to attachment to life, or if he does not turn away from it, he should understand. I have not developed the perception of death. There is no distinction between my earlier condition and my present one. I have not attained the fruit of development. Thus he clearly comprehends this. But if, when he often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of death, his mind shrinks away from attachment to life, and either equanimity or revulsion becomes settled in him, he should understand, I have developed the perception of death. There is a distinction between my earlier condition and my present one. I have attained the fruit of development. Thus he clearly comprehends this. When it was said, the perception of death, bhikkhus, when developed and cultivated, is of great fruit and benefit, culminating in the deathless, having the deathless as its consummation, it is because of this that this was said. It was said, the perception of the repulsiveness of food, bhikkhus, when developed and cultivated, is of great fruit and benefit, culminating in the deathless, having the deathless as its consummation. For what reason was this said? When a bhikkhu often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of the repulsiveness of food, his mind shrinks away from craving for tastes, turns back from it, rolls away from it, and is not drawn toward it, and either equanimity or revulsion becomes settled in him. Just as a rooster's feather or a strip of sinew thrown into a fire shrinks away from it, turns back from it, rolls away from it, and is not drawn toward it, so it is in regard to craving for tastes when a bhikkhu often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of the repulsiveness of food. If, when a bhikkhu often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of the repulsiveness of food, his mind inclines to craving for tastes, or if he does not turn away from them, he should understand, I have not developed the perception of the repulsiveness of food. There is no distinction between my earlier condition and my present one. I have not attained the fruit of development. Thus he clearly comprehends this. But if, when he often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of the repulsiveness of food, his mind shrinks away from craving for tastes, and either equanimity or revulsion becomes settled in him, he should understand, I have developed the perception of the repulsiveness of food. There is a distinction between my earlier condition and my present one. I have attained the fruit of development. Thus he clearly comprehends this. When it was said, the perception of the repulsiveness of food, bhikkhus, when developed and cultivated, is of great fruit and benefit, culminating in the deathless, having the deathless as its consummation. It is because of this that this was said. It was said, the perception of non-delight in the entire world, bhikkhus, when developed and cultivated, is of great fruit and benefit, culminating in the deathless, having the deathless as its consummation. For what reason was this said? When a bhikkhu often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of non-delight in the entire world, his mind shrinks away from the world's beautiful things, turns back from them, rolls away from them, and is not drawn toward them, and either equanimity or revulsion becomes settled in him. Just as a rooster's feather or a strip of sinew thrown into a fire shrinks away from it, turns back from it, rolls away from it, and is not drawn toward it, so it is in regard to the world's beautiful things, when a bhikkhu often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of non-delight in the entire world. If, when a bhikkhu often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of non-delight in the entire world, his mind inclines to the world's beautiful things, or if he does not turn away from them, he should understand, I have not developed the perception of non-delight in the entire world. There is no distinction between my earlier condition and my present one. I have not attained the fruit of development. Thus he clearly comprehends this. But if, when he often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of non-delight in the entire world, his mind shrinks away from the world's beautiful things, and either equanimity or revulsion becomes settled in him, he should understand, I have developed the perception of non-delight in the entire world. There is a distinction between my earlier condition and my present one. I have attained the fruit of development. Thus he clearly comprehends this. When it was said, the perception of non-delight in the entire world, bhikkhus, when developed and cultivated, is of great fruit and benefit, culminating in the deathless, having the deathless as its consummation. It is because of this that this was said. It was said, the perception of impermanence, bhikkhus, when developed and cultivated, is of great fruit and benefit, culminating in the deathless, having the deathless as its consummation. For what reason was this said? When a bhikkhu often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of impermanence, his mind shrinks away from gain, honor, and praise, turns back from them, rolls away from them, and is not drawn toward them, and either equanimity or revulsion becomes settled in him. Just as a rooster's feather or a strip of sinew thrown into a fire shrinks away from it, turns back from it, rolls away from it, and is not drawn toward it, so it is in regard to gain, honor, and praise, when a bhikkhu often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of impermanence. If, when a bhikkhu often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of impermanence, his mind inclines to gain, honor, and praise, or if he does not turn away from them, he should understand, I have not developed the perception of impermanence. There is no distinction between my earlier condition and my present one. I have not attained the fruit of development. Thus he clearly comprehends this. But if, when he often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of impermanence, his mind shrinks away from gain, honor, and praise, and either equanimity or revulsion becomes settled in him, he should understand, I have developed the perception of impermanence. There is a distinction between my earlier condition and my present one. I have attained the fruit of development. Thus he clearly comprehends this. When it was said, the perception of impermanence, bhikkhus, when developed and cultivated, is of great fruit and benefit, culminating in the deathless, having the deathless as its consummation, it is because of this that this was said. It was said, the perception of suffering in the impermanent, bhikkhus, when developed and cultivated, is of great fruit and benefit, culminating in the deathless, having the deathless as its consummation. For what reason was this said? When a bhikkhu often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of suffering in the impermanent, a keen perception of danger becomes settled in him toward indolence, laziness, slackness, heedlessness, lack of effort, and unreflectiveness, just as toward a murderer with a drawn sword. If, when a bhikkhu often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of suffering in the impermanent, a keen perception of danger does not become settled in him toward indolence, laziness, slackness, heedlessness, lack of effort, and unreflectiveness, just as toward a murderer with a drawn sword, he should understand, I have not developed the perception of suffering in the impermanent. There is no distinction between my earlier condition and my present one. I have not attained the fruit of development. Thus he clearly comprehends this. But if, when he often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of suffering in the impermanent, a keen perception of danger becomes settled in him toward indolence, laziness, slackness, heedlessness, lack of effort, and unreflectiveness, just as toward a murderer with a drawn sword, he should understand, I have developed the perception of suffering in the impermanent. There is a distinction between my earlier condition and my present one. I have attained the fruit of development. Thus he clearly comprehends this. When it was said, the perception of suffering in the impermanent, bhikkhus, when developed and cultivated, is of great fruit and benefit, culminating in the deathless, having the deathless as its consummation, it is because of this that this was said. It was said, the perception of non-self in what is suffering, bhikkhus, when developed and cultivated, is of great fruit and benefit, culminating in the deathless, having the deathless as its consummation. For what reason was this said? When a bhikkhu often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of non-self in what is suffering, his mind is devoid of I-making, mind-making, and conceit regarding this conscious body and all external objects. It has transcended discrimination and is peaceful and well liberated. If, when a bhikkhu often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of non-self in what is suffering, his mind is not devoid of I-making, mind-making, and conceit regarding this conscious body and all external objects, if it does not transcend discrimination and become peaceful and well liberated, he should understand, I have not developed the perception of non-self in what is suffering. There is no distinction between my earlier condition and my present one. I have not attained the fruit of development. Thus he clearly comprehends this. But if, when he often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of non-self and what is suffering, his mind is devoid of I-making, mind-making, and conceit regarding this conscious body and all external objects, and if it has transcended discrimination and become peaceful and well liberated, he should understand, I have developed the perception of non-self and what is suffering. There is a distinction between my earlier condition and my present one. I have attained the fruit of development. Thus he clearly comprehends this. When it was said, the perception of non-self and what is suffering, bhikkhus, when developed and cultivated, is of great fruit and benefit, culminating in the deathless, having the deathless as its consummation. It is because of this that this was said. These 7 perceptions, bhikkhus, when developed and cultivated, are of great fruit and benefit, culminating in the deathless, having the deathless as their consummation. And I really like that one because the Buddha is talking about the cause and effect. So if anybody's wondering how to overcome laziness, for example, then there's that particular perception of developing the perception of the suffering and that which is impermanent. That results in overcoming laziness or anything else that any quality we want to develop. There's that cause and effect relationship and those perceptions that need to be developed. Any questions on that before we go on, or comments? Uh-huh.
You said the term was revulsion?
Yeah, that's how Bhikkhu Bodhi translates it. I can't remember the Pali term. Revulsion is, I think he's translating whatever term that is from etymologically. It's like it's all disenchantment is another translation, which is perhaps better. But he takes the etymology, and I forget the Pali for that. Nibbida, nibbidati, world weariness. Yeah, that's the weary, you become weary of it. Revulsion probably isn't the best translation. I like disenchantment better, but that didn't come. You can also read that into it, because it's not, like revulsion is more like disgust, but that's not, nibbida is more like one becomes weary of it.
Practice that develops a perception of non-delight in the entire world?
Good question. I think just reminding yourself of it. It's like you're developing that perception. But it's, with developing the perception of unattractiveness, you have all those body contemplations and everything, or suffering. You reflect on suffering. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, death is suffering, and so on. But with developing that non-delight in the entire world, that could be like a certain attitude. It's like an attitude of Ajahn Sucitto talks about it as like stepping back from, needing to be in certain situations in order to practice, needing to be in beautiful surroundings, or being dependent on being surrounded by beauty all the time. It could be that that's just one thought coming to mind. I get this idea of like, when I think of that perception, I think of monks like Ajahn Ganha, who early on had a monastery in the city with like railroad tracks nearby, and it was like not very nice surroundings. Not like here where it's a beautiful forest and mountains, but still, like he was able to, it wasn't a problem for him. He was still able to practice in those surroundings. Or Prapayutto, who's like was in a similar type of situation. And so it's not to say like to go out of your way and, surround yourself with ugly things, but that mind of non-attachment or aloofness from the world. That's what I read into that. So, this talk is a year of metta. This is chapter 7 of part 2. It's page 119 in Bloom. Well, believe it or not, I'm not quite finished with metta. The older I get, the longer I talk about love, because I realize there's a lot that hasn't been said about how to do this and how to maintain this. Unless you're in a retreat situation where you have nothing else to do, you can't be thinking, may I be well, happy, and peaceful. May all beings be well, happy, and peaceful. Or reciting the Metta Sutta all the time. You can't be muttering this to yourself or having this distracted memory thing or an inner recitation going on all the time. At what point do you stop doing that? And when you stop, what then? How do you manage to take this into life? Do you walk around in loving kindness? First of all, you can initiate loving kindness in the morning when you get up. You need to develop a formula for yourself, and it doesn't have to be the recitation of the Metta Sutta, although that might be fine. You have to find a little form that is not just a formula of words, but perhaps some sort of images, so the feeling is actually there. When you get up in the morning and you are in this feeling of loving kindness, you don't have to be in a state of deep trance, of jhana. You're not going to be brushing your teeth and walking around in jhanas. You're going to be in your pajamas. But certainly, you're able to have a loving attitude. So, first thing in the morning, you check yourself over for what's present in you. Am I a little burdened? Am I cheerful? What's going on with me? Am I irritated? If you're recognizing that the hindrances are present, then metta is not. You have a duty to say, okay, I have to let go of these negative and worried sorts of states. Notice that in the Eightfold Path under right intention, there are 3 right intentions: non-ill will, non-cruelty, renunciation. Non-ill will is the absence of ill will. It isn't specifically formulated as love. Metta, of course, does have right intention, but metta is just one form of non-ill will. There are many forms of non-ill will. At the very minimum, you are proceeding into the day with right intention of non-ill will. So you begin by checking yourself over for the presence of ill will in all its varieties and colors and tastes. Boredom is a form of aversion and therefore ill will. All the negative structures that don't feel good are forms of ill will. Even thoughts like, I can't wait for that coffee, could be ill will. Start at the baseline, at least devoid of ill will and the other types of hindrances, worry and anxiety and agitation. If you think this process takes an hour or entire retreat, then you have to work out a more condensed form. This is the kind of thing that can be done, they say, in a finger snap. The Buddha says to the monks, if you can manage to get metta for a finger snap, then the alms that you are given, the support structure you are given, has now been discharged. Your debt has been discharged. It's possible in a finger snap. That's powerful, isn't it? At the baseline, we take a little time, maybe a few minutes, taking a second for a deep breath and say, okay, why would I not wish that all conscious beings be well, including myself? What possible reservation could I have? What possible reason could I have for not allowing that to appear? There's just no reason, considering the situation for a living being in this universe with all its mysterious and unknowable aspects. Any being, perhaps excluding a Buddha, is somewhat at a loss. We're lost children, even in the human realm. Maybe more in the human realm because we have a sophisticated thought process. We're lost to some degree. Who doesn't have empathy for a lost person, a lost child in a sense? So we drop the ill will. Considering all the beings that behave in a reprehensible way, there's always reasons behind it. Primarily, they just don't know any better. There has to be some element of forgiveness there. It seems the right thing to do to forgive, including ourselves, including our past. Don't spend a lot of time on this. It doesn't have to be worked through carefully. It's not the Nuremberg trials. Your life is not going to be carefully weighed by a jury. It's just that you're off the hook. The Buddha said. So I trust the Buddha. I'm off the hook. Then the Buddha invites you to have a nice café au lait with him. That is, a warm welcome into the morning. To come to good-heartedness, it doesn't have to be extraordinary or dramatic. You find the relaxation which that emotion brings up. It brings a softening of the face. One of the benefits of loving kindness is your countenance is pleasant. Your face relaxes, the muscles relax, and you look as good as you can look. He doesn't say everybody's beautiful. He just says whatever countenance you have, it's as good as it can be. You're trying to induce this. Get back in touch with it. Remember what it feels like. It doesn't take much. This is changing the set point in the morning. That reminds me of a sutta where the Buddha says, monks, do you see that monk coming in the distance who's ugly and not nice to look upon? He's an arhat. Then you carry it through the day. If you start to lose it, you feel the hindrances creeping in. You say, I've lost my metta. You take a breath and relax your face. Remember the image that helps you trigger it. If you're an abstract sort of person, it might be just a vast sense of the situation for living beings in the universe. If you're a particular type person, maybe then you have to think of a certain individual that reduces your worries and hostilities. You feel a sense of warmth. These are little triggers which you should get good at using and checking on. You can make yourself a determination, which I highly recommend, to do metta for a year. This doesn't mean that you can't have a conversation with anybody and that you're preoccupied with nothing but metta and you can't make eggs in the morning. It has got to be kind of in the background and brought forward every day for a year. You will be transformed. You will never be the same person if you actually take that up seriously and say, my sadhana, my spiritual exercise for this year is to abide in profound friendliness, and the deeper, the better. The more you do this, and the more often you can enter it, and the deeper you can get, it's transformative. The Buddha is often saying, I have monks and nuns who dwell in this day and night. They live this way throughout their whole lives. You have to have a default mode. You've got to be feeling something. You've got to be somewhere. And 5 of the defaults are not available to a good Buddhist. That is, the 5 hindrances are not options. So if we're not going to dwell there, where are we going to dwell? Metta is a great one for just carrying around, especially toward evening, moving towards sleep, so that it pervades the dreams. We talked about nightmares and stuff the other night, but it's a very interesting experiment to see if you can induce beautiful dreams. You should be kind of eager for that as well. Take a whole year and say, for the last hour before bed, just spend an hour bringing up positive things and dropping negative things. See if this affects your dreams. You can even keep a journal, a dream book, on the quality of your dreams. This is a possibility of affecting the mind 24 hours a day, and it's something that doesn't wear out. You won't get tired. At the end of the year, you won't say, okay, enough of the love stuff. Let's get back to some hostility here. It just won't happen. It's finally the perpetual motion machine. I had this revelation that it's similar to living off-grid with a generator, solar panels, and a battery bank. Maybe I thought of this because it was raining today and our batteries were getting down, so I turned the generator on. I realized that's what happens with metta. When there's no sunshine, your batteries are getting low and you're starting to slip. The sunshine is when metta is sustained. you're able to carry it. But there are times when the environment around you tends to be a bit deprived. You're in traffic. It's not going anywhere. You can feel your battery, your metta structure is declining. The natural environment around you is not enough to help uplift you. Then you have to turn the generator on. Don't let it go down below 80%. It's hard on your batteries. You get the best bang for your buck if you don't go below 50%, actually. So you have to check every now and then, is the level adequate? If it's okay, at least at non-ill will, you're in the zone. But every now and then you have to generate. That means you specifically go back to the very idea to formulate it, repeat it. Accompany it perhaps with a change of facial expression. Sometimes you have to do bodily gestures first for the mind to remember what it feels like. Athletes go through the motions with their body to remember what it feels like. So too, you can change your expression on your face and you'll be surprised. Don't do this at the office, but in privacy or in the forest, you can use the bodily gestures of St. Francis. You should have a bag of tricks, maybe even a few photos on your cell phone of Mother Teresa looking at a child or something like that. Something that triggers the warmth of metta. That's why people carry these photos around. They look at those dear to them and it cheers them up. Don't hesitate to use that. Put that in the metta scrapbook you're making. Collect any lines, poems, phrases, pictures, snippets of somebody talking, and have it available to help trigger metta when you need it. I remember when Ajahn Jivako was living here, he had a metta wall in his locker. It was all like sadhus smiling and like different people hugging each other. This is a whole range of techniques that helps to restore the feeling, and this is punctuating the day. When you get the opportunity, see how far you can carry it. Every now and then you'll have a morning or evening meditation when you have nothing else to do. See how deeply you can go with this. If it's very, very joyful, you might get tears. Don't be too shy about trying to induce that sense of joy and good-heartedness that can bring a few tears of joy. Tonight we recited the 4 foundations of mindfulness. Right effort is simply a formulation of what you're about to do with mindfulness. It corrects your mindfulness. It tells you, you're going to make these types of effort. How? Through mindfulness. What is it you're going to do with mindfulness? You're going to remove the hindrances. That's the primary function of mindfulness. Mindfulness is not merely paying attention. If you don't have the goal, the 4 foundations of mindfulness can be quite complicated since it seems numerous things are going on. You're watching the body, the feelings, the mind, then the Dhamma structures. Do you do it all at once, or do you do it sequentially, or what? Do you stay with one? I think the answer will be much more clear if you remember the refrain. Just to the extent necessary for overcoming covetousness and grief for the world. Just to the extent necessary for overcoming the hindrances. Why are you inspecting the body? For what purpose? Is it to know the 9 stages of decomposition of the corpse in case you have to write an exam on this, or work at a coroner's office, or go into forensics? No, it's not for that reason. It's for overcoming covetousness and grief for the world. When you examine the body, ask yourself, why would the body produce covetousness and grief for the world? Ask yourself that question and it starts to make sense. The Buddha is asking you to see that the ordinary way we look at bodies causes us grief and sorrow and problems. So we have to look at them a different way so that we don't have the grief and the sorrow there. We recognize the body's transience. Then, when we do experience transformations of the body, and even ultimately death, we don't see it as a big problem. We see it as the nature of the body. If I can remember that, I will be treating it correctly so that the experience of the body and having a body doesn't lead to grief and sorrow. Again, with the sensations, the feelings, pleasant, neutral, and painful, and also spiritual and bodily feelings, in relation to both the worldly and unworldly, we're looking at them just so they don't lead us into a condition of grief. Ask yourself, When have I felt a bit sad or bereft or covetous? When have I felt that I wanted something back? When has a feeling slipped away on me and I want it back? In those cases, I was covetous. Wherever it came from, out in the world, whatever object that it came from or the feeling itself, I want that thing. I covet it, or I grieve at its presence or at its absence. How would I avoid that? I'm enjoying the experience. Should I not have the experience? You just have to see that watching of a pleasant experience. I want it to last. And watch that wanting. Try to acknowledge the reality of the experience and just say, it doesn't last. It won't last. Do this as you have this experience. Then check to see how you feel afterwards, after it departs. Note whether you're surprisingly okay, not feeling regretful. It's not about taking all of the fun out of the world or taking pleasant feelings away. And, of course, you can't ultimately remove unpleasant feelings either. But it is about handling these skillfully, carefully. Then the bumps are smoothed out, resulting in a huge reduction in the amount of suffering. I don't know what the formula would be, but probably 98% less suffering than I would have if I hadn't reflected. It doesn't last. It won't last. 98% is not bad. This doesn't have to be super normal. You just do it enough that it starts to take on a life of its own. It pops up almost by itself. Right in the middle of the situation, you get a little insight. There it goes again. Oh, right. That was the last cookie. That's how you know the potential for mundane, regular suffering in the ordinary curve of the day has been reduced. The ordinary person could reduce their suffering by 50%. I used to have a little formula. I used to ask people, how do you like to cut your suffering by 50% in 5 years? Sound good? It's entirely possible. No enlightenment necessary. No jhana necessary. 50% cut. I don't tell them 5 days. 5 years. 50%. It's doable. If you're a keen student, could be more. You could certainly reduce the mundane, ordinary texture of the day's suffering by huge quantities, even 80 to 90%. You might still suffer when the crunch comes and the hard stuff happens, the dramatic stuff. You might feel that, but your recovery will be much faster. This is the benefit of working with the hindrances. This small effect on the day when you look at the body or the feelings, when you look at the mind as, what is the mind? Angry or not? Greedy or not? Confused or not? Exalted or not? Expansive or contracted? Just to the extent necessary for helping you let go of this grabbing on and pushing away. There's a huge confusion around this. The Buddha never talks about allowing negative and positive mental states to come through and just watch them, allowing them to be and pass away. He doesn't talk about it that way. When you have a negative state such as anger, you are grasping. Anger is a synonym for attachment. Anger and attachment are the same thing, with just a little more detail as to what it is to be attached. You're not detached from anger, ever. Anger is a specific type of attachment. The Buddha says, let go of anger, let go of it. You can't watch anger dispassionately. You are passionately involved in it. You're passionately attached. This is something to be handled quickly and deliberately, and that's what mindfulness is. It's primarily around the removal of the 5 hindrances. That's what right effort is. That's the instructions. Now go do it. How do you do it? Where are you going to find these 5 hindrances? In the body, or your relationship to the body, in the feelings, your relationship to the feelings, mental states. Not your relationship to mental states, but the mental states themselves. If you have anger, you don't have a relationship with it. It is the attachment. If you have a feeling, you have a relationship to the feeling. You can have pain and be detached, have pleasure and be detached. The Buddha has pleasant feelings and painful feelings, but he doesn't have anger. Anger is the attachment. The distinction between mental states and feelings in the body is so confused in so many books and teachings. Feelings in the body can be looked at objectively with detachment. Mental states, if they're negative, you're not looking at them with detachment at all. They are functioning as hindrances. In the 4 foundations of mindfulness, you're looking with informed attention that has a set of instructions to it. The instructions are to rapidly push the buttons to appropriately respond to the situation. In the body, kaya nupassana. In the feelings, vedana nupassana. In the mental states, chitta nupassana. And in the dhammas, dhamma nupassana. The dhammas are groupings, and the groupings are almost a repetition of the whole thing. One of the groupings is the 5 hindrances and your duty toward them. The duty? To remove them. The positive mental states, such as the cultivation of the 7 factors of enlightenment, are to be preserved, not removed, not just watched as they arise and pass away. That's an instruction for something else. Positive mental states are to be sustained and developed. Mindfulness has to have the right instruction for what to do with the contents of the mind. There is both mindfulness of mind and mindfulness of Dhamma categories. When you look at mindfulness of Dhamma categories, it is almost repeating mindfulness of mind. There's anger involved and non-anger involved. There's grief involved and non-grief. But in the Dhamma categories, we see them in a structure of hindrances or positive things like the 7 factors. They're to be treated in a specific way in the context of the teachings. When you come to the body and the bodily feelings and the 4 foundations of mindfulness, you watch objectively with detachment. When it comes to mental states, your first duty is to identify. Before you detach from something, you've got to know what it is, and that's not easy. Most people are rather cloudy about what's going on in their minds at any given time. It takes a lot of watching carefully and identifying by its feeling tone. Anger is always accompanied by a feeling tone that is a different feeling from something like a sprained or cut finger. The feeling tone that accompanies a mental state like anger is characteristically always negative, always painful, and that is its identifying mark. You can't have intellectual anger unaccompanied by unpleasant feeling. That's not anger. That's a series of words floating in the mind. So-and-so is evil. If it's not accompanied by unpleasant feeling, it's not anger. Anger is known by its feeling tone. Desire is known by its feeling tone. Confusion is known by its feeling tone. You start to recognize these primary feeling tones. Then, when that primary identification has taken place, your mindfulness should be getting sharper and faster so it shifts over to the next category. What is this in the Dhamma categories? Is this one of the 5 hindrances, or is this joy? Am I supposed to be afraid of joy, afraid to attach to joy? Am I supposed to just let it arise and pass away? No, if you do that, it's wrong. Joy, if it is based on spiritual things, is a factor of enlightenment, not to be let go, but rather maintained and increased. You're not supposed to be walking around in a kind of dead zone of wooden detachment. Such things as joy are primary enlightenment factors and very positive emotions to be sustained and cultivated. When you lose it, go back and find it, create it again. Your mindfulness will tell you this. You're on to something good. Keep it. Keep it. When you begin with the 4 foundations of mindfulness, it can get awfully complicated. It's kind of like driving a car, a stick shift, a certain car, but after a while you get quite good at it. It becomes a single event. It's not a problem then. You can even have a conversation while driving. This is exactly right. With mindfulness, the camera is on even in the midst of a conversation. You're watching yourself. What am I thinking? What am I feeling? Am I reacting? You can still carry on a conversation. Mindfulness can be present in the midst of the activities of life. It must be present in the midst of the activities of life. So the function of mindfulness is to rid yourself of the hindrances, and you know that mindfulness You know that mindfulness has been successful because you have arrived at the doorstep of the 8th factor of the Eightfold Path, right concentration. The 6th factor of right effort is the instructions about what you are to rid yourself of. Remove the hindrances, prevent them from re-arising, sustain any factors of jhana or positive mental states which have arisen, and if any haven't come up yet, go and find them and start bringing them up by all these suggested strategies, by remembering people who produce a sense of loving kindness, or watching your breath, or changing the expression on your face, or changing your bodily posture, or hearing a Dhamma talk. This is your positive, proactive attempt to bring up these positive mental states following the instruction in Factor 6. Factor 7 of right mindfulness is all of the details of the objects which you would use to accomplish this. And when you've accomplished this, how do you know? Because the hindrances have subsided. You've now passed the 7th factor, and you're about to enter the 8th factor. What is the primary requisite for the 8th? Even the beginning? Even the edge, the neighborhood of the 8th factor? The hindrances have subsided. Then 5 positive things have to arise, perhaps in a weak form. This is applied and sustained attention to an object. You feel your mind is lifting toward a meditation object and there is emotion, joy. Check over the body. Pain is dropping away. The body is not a problem. Quality of the emotive mind is that you're not separating the mind from the heart or emotional development. There is ekagata, meaning one-pointedness, but really better understood as wholeheartedness. You are wholeheartedly involved now in this project. All of you is available. None of you is thinking about something else or distracted. You're immersed. Your whole interest is focused. That's what they're getting at. So now 5 things have come up in some weak form. You're attending. You might be wavering a little bit, but you keep setting it back up there, lifting and placing. It's interesting. It's joyful. There's energy in it. The problematic nature of the body has receded, and you're kind of in love with what you're doing. Love is wholehearted attention, isn't it? As a mother holds her baby, it's a very wholehearted experience, isn't it? That's the characteristic of ekagata, one-pointedness. That's what mindfulness is, the bridge to concentration. Sometimes it's treated as a thing in itself, as a pure exercise in attention. It's really a part of the path. When you get to even the neighborhood of samadhi, you can legitimately call yourself a contemplative. It's possible you can even call yourself a bhikkhu, even though you are not a monk. When the Buddha was teaching this, he gives credit to somebody who can attain this as being a bhikkhu. Questions, comments?
Reminds me of Jeet's question where he was saying just jump in, and then tranquility, but he brought up more of like the discernment, kind of the Dhamma factors.
Like the 4th foundation of mindfulness he was talking about. Yeah, that's the relinquishing the hindrances. And yeah, I thought of, just at the end now, I thought of that second part of the sutta where the Buddha's saying, monks, do you see that bhikkhu coming in the distance who's ugly and nasty to behold? He's an arhat, he's beautiful inside. And then the next one he says, do you see that monk who has a lovely complexion and is very wonderful to look upon? He's rotten to the core. So nothing is fixed. There's a Thai man who said that when he meditates, the first thing he does is he takes a drink of water and then he focuses on the feeling of the water going down his throat, and that he found that helpful for his meditation.
I'm wondering, sometimes like all these techniques techniques and instructions can seem a bit like I can grasp onto them as like, oh, I need to do this, or like I need to get this thing that I don't have, or I need to try to accomplish this thing, and it kind of it can become like forcing or kind of like striving. And I've found that actually when I kind of uphold them but let go, then it actually can work. So I'm just wondering if you have anything to say about kind of not and yet upholding, and how to kind of make this function in a wholesome way.
It's like Ajahn Sona was saying, just enough to release covetousness and grief for the world. And it's a lot of different, and just for the relinquishing of the hindrances. So lots of these different tools. It's like having a tool bag. You develop all these different tools, but you don't use all the tools at the same time. You're just using one tool at a time, whatever's needed. So it's like just developing the skill, having all those tools there, and you don't need to hold all your tools all the time. It's not like you need to be like reciting all of the 4 foundations of mindfulness all the time, or using all the tools all the time, just to remember that they're there. So and Ajahn Mun said this is when somebody asked Ajahn Mun a similar question. He said something like, the study of the Dhamma is good, but the mind is just the mind, and you don't need to be thinking of your studies all the time. But after you study it, it'll be there, and it'll come up when you need it. So it's not like you need to be, it'll get, like Ajahn Sona again saying, like developing these little triggers where you're feeling agitated, so you develop that habit of relaxing the face or having these little techniques in your tool belt, and ways of coming back to the meditation. Or like one that I like is, if there's irritation or anger, rather than speaking based on it, like stopping and taking a deep breath, and then rather than just reacting. So just developing these simple tools, but they'll be there when you need it. You don't need to be like thinking of them all the time. Cool.
The perceptions sutta, like sometimes I can listen to that and then get really excited about like, oh, okay, I know I need to develop such and such, but I feel like on some level I'm already like doing a lot. It's like I already have like a lot of agendas and plans and things. There's like one more thing, you know, like I just pop in my entire what I think I'm doing.
Yeah.
It's all anything.
That can be a hindrance as well, is that the hindrance is that perception that it's a lot. So like feeling like we have a lot already, that's just a perception. So that perception that I have a lot on already, that's actually the hindrance. It's not actually the a lot that's the hindrance. It's just that the perception that I'm doing all this stuff, or that I'm adding one more thing to a big stack. But all of this is just part of the mind training toolkit that we have. So the mind, because it's immaterial, it's not like we're going to fill up our memory bank. We're not going to run out of memory, or we're not going to run out of space. We can memorize the entire Tipitaka and not run out of space. So it's like Ajahn Mun said, like you study it, or you put it there and you bring it up at the right time. But it's actually very wholesome to get fired up about these things. So if you hear about developing perception of impermanence in order to overcome, gain honor and fame, and you get really fired up about it, that's a good thing. That's actually very good. That's far better than being fired up about somebody else's faults, or just like how the other person did that project wrong and I know the right way to do it.
Specifically, like, when I'm here today, and then I kind of had this idea that I was going to practice Metta today, listen to it, it feels like it's going to take an hour. It feels like that's not easy. It's going to take a long time to like actually set it.
Well, like, yeah, getting fired up about like contemplating death or perception of impermanence, that doesn't mean you don't have metta. So metta can be in the background. It can be an underlying, it can be why you're getting fired up even. It's out of metta for yourself. And so it's like, you don't have to be like, all things are impermanent. Well, may I be well, may I be well. Oh, wait, no, death. But it's all good. I mean, even if you're cycling between those things, that's far better than any alternatives of things, unwholesome mental states that could be arising. That's actually a very subtle form of hindrance. Is where the Buddha actually praises it until you're an anagami, and then he says it's a hindrance only for an anagami, it's a word called Dhamma raga, which literally means like lust for the Dhamma or passion for the Dhamma. But if the Dhamma raga doesn't disappear for an anagami, then they don't become an arhat. They just remain as an anagami. But for us, it's a good thing, and it's a quality that we need. You have a question? Yeah.
So the sutta on perceptions, I think the seventh one on impermanence and laziness and all that kind of stuff. So just give me your number one turnaround for when you want to take a nap.
Number one turnaround?
Yeah, to remind yourself that you can't take a nap because everything's impermanent and you must.
It's not saying you can't take a nap. It's not saying don't sleep. But laziness and the discipline of the noble ones is like remembering to cultivate wholesome mental states. And I mean, it does have an aspect of not sleeping too much as well. But
not necessarily sleep, but
the turnaround for like laying down or resting the body, taking a kip in the afternoon, is that you're probably going to have in a 24-hour period, you're probably going to then sleep less. And you might have more energy and be more clear in the evening time, so it's not forbidden. Even the Buddha was known to lie down from time to time, even during the day. Not very often, but
sometimes I felt like I just don't want to do anything,
right.
Kind of like downtrodden.
That's called indolence.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, more like.
Well, that's the whole thing. That's why we cultivate that perception. So the fruit of that perception really taking root, and these are difficult perceptions to develop. They really go against our current perceptions.
What do you like?
So the perception is and the perception of suffering and the impermanent, it's connected with the perception of impermanence. So those last three perceptions, they're all connected. There's the perception of the impermanent, the perception of suffering in the impermanent, the perception of non-self in that which is suffering. And so we have to actually consciously bring that up. Things like when we develop a perception of suffering, we can use the stock phrase of the stock formula of birth is suffering, aging is suffering, death is suffering, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are suffering, etc. Separation from the loved is suffering. Attachment to the unloved is suffering. And so, we might think, well, I'm aging, there's not much time. So if we develop that perception, that's the perception of suffering and the impermanent. If we develop the perception of aging, or the perception of, this, I don't know how long I have, then we might, and when that perception becomes deeply rooted, and it's not like it's just going to come about through thinking it a few times, but we do have to bring it up and think about it and consider it. The perception change comes from deep consideration of the truth of the way things are. I don't know how much time I have, and I don't know how long I'm going to have energy to do this. So then we get out on the walking meditation path, or we decide to sit and cultivate metta or whatever, or do another wholesome activity. It's not just sitting and walking. We decide to go to the kitchen at 4 a.m. That's energy. You could be sleeping at that time. So that's like, I need to do something wholesome. I need to do something good. That's when that perception starts to get ingrained. It's not, but then it's not like restlessly just rushing around, which it can get into that as well. But it's like, what can I do? How can I be using my energies that I have now in a wholesome way? Yeah, or like if I go to my kuti and I feel like, well, I'm not really tired, but I'm kind of bored and don't have anything to do, I think I'll just, and I kind of like don't want to do anything, then maybe that's a good time to like go for a walk or walk up to the chedi site or bring up some physical energy somehow or get out on the walking meditation path, or even think, do I need something, like do my robes need to be mended? I could get out the needle and thread and focus that way. So developing all these skillful means to having a conversation with Ajahn Sona one time, because we're both Leos. So one characteristic of Leos is that when there's nothing to like do and accomplish, we tend to just lie down and sleep. So that's I do find I have that characteristic, and like if there's not, but then like when there's something like that needs to be accomplished, then we can get up and put full energy into it. But then when there's nobody to help and nothing to accomplish, then we just fall asleep. like lions, they just, after they've done everything they need to do, they just fall asleep. So so like we have to find some way to go against that.
Right, that's what I was asking. I do the same thing. I'm just like, well, I'll just nap now. I have an idea when I wake up.
Yeah, I mean, and there is a time and place for that. I mean, there's a difference between lying down for 30 minutes or something, or like lying down for 4 hours in the middle of the day, where one is going to be useful, the other is probably not going to be so useful, and then seeing the result of it too when we contemplate the result of these things. So like when we just have what we call a hard soak, just sleep all afternoon, and you get the kind of yoga mat lines on the face, and then the result of that is the mind is quite unmindful afterwards, and not able to really meditate very easily, and it's not sharp, it's not clear, it's very fuzzy and dark, muddled. So but we've all, had this, or most of us have anyway. Maybe some people are diligent all the time, and they've never been lazy ever. But I know I've definitely been there. But then the patient endurance, that's where patient endurance comes in. Like you keep going. Like you have to reflect on, like in that sutta also it says, if he doesn't have this, he clearly comprehends, I haven't developed this yet, thus he knows it. So like at least we know we haven't developed that yet, and then we can keep doing it, keep moving forward. But then if you know you've developed it, you can delight in that, bring up joy, and delight that there has been that sense of development. I'm no longer in the same state as my previous state. But all these things, I mean, even Luang Por he had to deal with these things for a long time, and even for him, he was plugging away at developing these perceptions, and it took him a very long time to develop these things, because that's the nature of the mind, the nature of the hindrances is they're very, very strong. So it takes a fair amount of time of like considering it all the time, reflecting. Okay.